Welcome to the Metro Transit TOD Forum, Building 21st Century Suburbs. Your programs say that Brian Lamb is giving the introduction. Unfortunately, Brian couldn't be here today, so I'm his hopefully good enough. Oh, I'm not going to say that. I just want to take a very few minutes here and tell you a little bit about Metro Transit, since I know lots of you took Metro Transit here, right? But not everybody. So let's get started. Metro Transit, as for any good organization, great people make great service. And a lot of people don't realize how many employees we have. We have, about 3,200 now and growing. That includes almost 200 police officers and our employees, who are all wonderful and do a great job. If you ride our buses, you know that. Our employees reflect our community that we serve, and our police officers reflect the community that we serve. So we really are very actively conscious of both being part of the communities we serve and engaging the communities we serve. So our area is really huge, 907 square miles, which is 90 cities and 77 counties. I don't want to read all these numbers. I just want you to kind of glance at them and maybe later look them up again and kind of realize how much we do and how many places. So the region currently has a lot of transit, and we're moving on. So what are we doing in the future? The first thing we're doing is improving the customer experience, and we have a lot of different elements of this, and you see people out there building better bus stops, which is a whole program that's going on for several years. Some of that is new bus stops, and some of that is improvements to the bus stops we have. We're using technology. If you go to the App Store, you can find the Metro Transit app and pay for your fare on your phone. All the other things that we're doing there, we have Wi-Fi on all our trains, most of our buses, and soon we'll have all of the buses. So all kinds of things going on in the agency. Some of you may have ridden the A line. If you haven't, I strongly encourage you to do so. This is a new kind of service. It acts a little bit more like a light rail than a regular bus. You pay for your fare off the bus, and then you can board and leave through any door. It doesn't stop quite as often, and it has a little bit of signal priority, so it goes really fast, and it feels really fast. And the A line connects a lot of really good destinations, including up there towards the top. You can get off and take a very short bus ride to the State Fair. We plan to do a lot more of these. We've got a plan for 12 priority corridors across the region to offer this improved service. Now, we don't replace local service, we continue it, but it's kind of a backup for the intermediate stops. And so the local service and the A-line together, in the first year of operation, we had about 35% more ridership on that corridor. So we're encouraged by that and want to do that. And I think most people have read at least some of the news stories about the major transit ways, that we're going to extend our 2 light rail lines, the green line extension to the southwest, the blue line extension to the northwest, and we're also planning 2 new rapid bus lines. The orange line now is express service, but it will be kind of upgraded in a lot of ways and have really nice stations. The gold lines will serve the east end of the metro area. And then we have plans to extend the red line to the south. So we will have all this sort of different levels. The way that we have, everybody's familiar with roads, we have interstates, and then we have main roads, and then we have arterials, and then we have local streets. And we're doing the same thing with the transit system, that all of this works together. And it's not, do we do buses or rail? It's not, do we do A or B? It's like we kind of need the whole network and the whole system. So today, all of this is how do we grow as a region. And the other side of the growth is how do we build our development around transit. And a lot of areas in the region are not going to be built around transit. If you want to live in a place where you have to drive all the time, you have a lot of really nice choices out there. If you want to live in a place where you have some choices about how to get around, we don't have enough of those places because we don't have enough of the transit, and the transit we do have, we're still in the process of building out the areas around them. So today we want to look at a particular kind of transit-oriented development. And I guess I should say the Met Council adopted the Transit-Oriented Development Policy in 2013, and we started the TOD office in 2014. So we haven't been around a long time, but we're working really hard to try to serve the whole region. We want to be the one-stop shop on transit-oriented development. If you're a developer, come talk to us. If you're just an interested neighbor, come talk to us. We have a lot of stuff on our website, and I particularly want to feature a developer's guide to TOD, which is kind of like a 101 document that's frequently useful in talking to people who are going, what is this TOD thing out there? And so today we want to feature some of the interesting things that communities in our region have done, and we think these are really good examples for everybody of how you can build stuff that's transit-oriented around existing transit, or transit-oriented around planned transit, or transit-ready for future transit. Because if you build it right, we can put the transit in later. If you build it wrong, it's going to be really hard. Anyway, with that, I need to turn this microphone over to our wonderful moderator, Bruce Carlson of Westwood. Let's welcome Bruce Carlson.
Thank you, Lucy. Wow, what a beautiful room we have here today. I just want to say good morning and welcome, and we're really excited that everyone is here and grateful that you all came this morning. And we've worked hard to give you a good, interesting panel discussion today, I believe. We have an experienced panel and dynamic as well. We have them both from the public sector and the private side of development for us this morning. We intend for this morning's panel discussion to be interactive, so I'm going to be out here with a microphone so we can, during the entire panel at any time, stop, interrupt them, ask a question, say what our thoughts are, get their reaction to that this morning. So we're going to walk through a series of topics and talk about how that relates to current development in the suburbs and what that looks like maybe in the future, the near future, the middle future, and the far future as well, I think, as we go today. So I'm going to start with introductions, and I'm going to first start on our left with Jackie Bell. And Jackie is Director of Development at Kraus Anderson. She has over 15 years of experience in the real estate industry, focusing on development, planning, and design. Prior to joining KA, she was in real estate at Target for 11 years, where she worked on land development and leasehold acquisitions across the US and Canada. She has a Master's of Environmental Design from the University of Minnesota. And we'll hold applause, and everyone wouldn't break out no applause there, but we'll hold applause until we get to the end, and then we're gonna give them a big round of applause to welcome them. Next to Jackie is George Sherman of Sherman Associates. George is a 35-year veteran of both residential and commercial development. He has developed throughout the Midwest and Colorado. Sherman Associates frequently leads transit-oriented development initiatives as part of their mission of building communities and enriching neighborhoods. George has received the Lifetime Achievement Award in Commercial Real Estate from the Business Journal, and in 2016 was awarded the President's Award from the Preservation Alliance of Minnesota. Next to George is David Wellington. He is Director of Acquisitions and Development for Wellington Management. David's principal responsibility is identifying opportunities for commercial property acquisitions and new development projects. Before joining the company in 2014, David worked on a brokerage team in the Seattle, Washington area in the office of CBRE. He earned a BA from Whitman College and an MBA from the University of Washington. Next to David, introducing our public side of the panel, is Kirsten Algrim. She is the Director of Planning and Development for the City of Hopkins. She is best known for her complex projects, elevating art, atypical public engagement, and, says here, seducing the pedestrian. So we'll get into that more later. We'll cover that at the very end, so you have to stay to hear that one. Kirsten has a Bachelor's of Science in Urban and Regional Studies from Minnesota State Mankato, and 30 years of experience working for cities. Next to Kirsten is Tim Gladhill. He's the Community Development Director for the City of Ramsey. In addition to his role as Community Development Director, he also serves as the current President of the American Planning Association Minnesota chapter. Tim received a Bachelor's of Science in Geography and a Bachelor's of Science in Urban and Regional Studies from Minnesota State University Mankato, and a Master's of Geographic Information Science from the University of Minnesota. And finally, Bob Strader. He is the Community Development Director for the City of Oakdale. He's held similar positions for the cities of Columbia Heights and Minnetonka. He has a master's degree in urban and regional planning from Mankato State University. Is that the right way to say that? Mankato? It's changed so many times. My daughter even went there. And a doctorate in public administration from Hamline University. He teaches community economic development as an adjunct faculty member at the University of Minnesota Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Okay, now let's give him a warm round of applause for being here today. Okay, as we talk about transit, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start on the ground. And we want to talk about, we thought we'd start with walkability and how we get around and maybe how we walk to those transit opportunities. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to discuss, like, what does the term walkability mean? We hear that a lot. Can we go around to everyone and just get a brief idea of what you think? And I think, Bob, we'll start with you on what is walkability?
Well, for the city of Oakdale, we look at walkability now as we update our comprehensive plan as rethinking the design priorities for our local streets and our collectors to emphasize the pedestrian first, then bicycles, then transit, and then the automobile at certain appropriate locations in the city, not everywhere.
You know, George, I'm going to go around and get everybody's thoughts. George, I want to go next with you. Can you expand more on what your thoughts of walkability is? Does it mean just walking across the street, or do I have to walk for 5 miles, or what does it mean?
Well, walking was mankind's preferred method of getting around for the first 100,000 years of civilization. And then we domesticated,
right after the earth cooled, the dinosaurs came, right?
Then we domesticated the horse, and we kind of lost track of the human scale. But it really is about keeping in mind the human interaction and human scale in development and in community development when you start looking at laying out streets, housing, commercial. What is an appropriate connection that the human body, the human person wants in their community and in their connection? Whether it's visual, clearly it is, having attractive visual elements, whether it's comfort, size of sidewalks, safety, benchmarks. I mean, how far does a human body care to walk before it takes a break and interact with the surrounding? So it's really imagining yourself as a pedestrian and a human being walking around in a community, and what are your points of interest, what are your points of comfort level, your distances that you can travel and be engaged. It is subjective, but so I encourage people to not always have a defined measure of each of those, but that you need to keep each of those in context. I mean, walkable in New York City is a different experience than walkability on Hennepin Avenue. So, but it's human connection, development at the human scale as you look at your development parameters.
Jackie, how about for you? What does walkability look like for you, and what does it mean?
Yeah, very simply put for me, walkability is about the connectivity of uses and context. So, you know, I had jotted down some notes earlier, and it was interesting. Some of the things that George mentioned were very much the same, but its relative importance can be social, it can be economic, it can be environmental, it can be spiritual, it can be physical, and most importantly, historical, right? It's how we've always done it. I think that's pretty cool.
And do you apply all those things when you're thinking about a development coming up? And is that something you thought of 5 years ago or 10 years ago?
You know, I think it is. I think it's something that municipalities have consistently asked for, and I think it's something that, you know, customers continually look for. I don't think that is a new thing. I think it's a different lens today in connectivity and what we're connecting and how we're connecting it, but I don't think it's a new deal.
Kirsten, how does walkability apply to, let's talk about Hopkins, and the importance of it for Hopkins, for the entire city?
Well, for us, you know, I think we're fortunate. We were a city that developed around the turn of the century as a standalone city, and so we don't have the development pattern that a lot of suburbs are now trying to struggle to incorporate walkability into. So we started off in a good position, but really have seen our walkability, our bikeability, we have 5 regional trails that converge in Hopkins, as one of our competitive advantages. And so we're doing whatever we can to build on that and really emphasize that piece of our development pattern. Not replicating what anyone said, I would really emphasize safety. You know, it's just really at the heart of all walkability is having a safe place for people to walk. And even in Hopkins, we still had a lot of development that was auto-oriented, and some of our roadways have speeds that really aren't conducive to the pedestrian. And so we've been working hard to design for slower speeds on our bigger roadways. I once read a stat that a pedestrian auto collision at 5 miles an hour or at 20 miles an hour is about 5% results in death, but at 40 miles an hour it's 85%. So really trying to get those speeds down, separation from the automobile is really key to the kind of a starting point with walkability.
So when you talk about safety, you're talking about, first of all, just not getting hit by vehicles and buses and
I think that's the foundation, and then
okay.
of course you want to build from there with the fine-grained land use that provides interest along the way, connectivity, so you have places for people to go, but if it's not a safe path, it's not going to be used no matter, I think, what you have along it.
Okay.
So for Ramsey, obviously, it's an important topic for us. It's coming up in our comprehensive plan that's going to be due next year. We've taken the last year to really have listening sessions before we started talking about any sort of plans and policies. And walkability has really come up for all of our demographics, all of our generations. And so for us, I heard a comment from George that walkability in New York is much different than walkability in Minneapolis. Here in our region, the same is true on a different scale. Walkability in Ramsey that started to develop in the 70s is much different than Minneapolis and St. Paul. So as we think about our comprehensive plan, it's really thinking about first our land use plan. So where are those future residential neighborhoods and business districts going to be, and how are we going to make it so you can have a variety of those options, whether it be recreation, or your place of employment, a place to shop, or a place to work, are all within a reasonable walkable distance. I'm sure our definition of a 15-minute, 30-minute, or what is that definition of walkability is going to be different 30 minutes out from the central city in Ramsey than it is in Minneapolis and St. Paul. So our policies are going to be slightly different, but we're all aimed at that same goal to have walkability. And for us, the bicycle connections and the trails are such an important component of what we do and how we define our success for walkability.
Any questions or comments on walkability? So Bob, you haven't, and I want to get back to Bob real quick. Bob, can you add on a little bit more about your city and walkability, and it has to be an important for every single development, residential, commercial, public?
Well, I'd like to tell you we're the leaders in that, or have been. We're not. We have
Okay.
a trail system that's really about recreation. It's we have very few sidewalks. As we've done redevelopment over the last decade, we've incorporated them in a big way. But I think I want to just add to something George referenced, and I think when we're thinking about walkability, people need a reason to walk. It has to be safe, comfortable, and interesting. And so using those questions to let that determine the pedestrian environment's a good place to start, rather than come up with some specific formulaic, it's got to be within 1/8 of a mile of something. I think that's more important. That gets at the quality of the pedestrian environment.
David, let's wrap it up with you on walkability, your thoughts.
So I'm going to take the kind of the standard young developer archetype. In business school, we're constantly prepped to think about convenience when we're trying to change behavior from a psychological standpoint, and obviously that's to unlock the almighty dollar from the wallet. And I think that if we are trying to change behavior from cars to walking or cars to bikes, we have to make that convenient and a compelling case for consumers to do that. And I'm talking about consumers broadly with respect to everybody here. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that the convenience and kind of the independence that you get from being able to walk out the door as opposed to getting into a car, and those pain points really need to be highlighted in the marketing. And I think that both on the public and the private side need to push that as much as possible, and those connections that folks were talking about to amenities and goods and services and parks and recreation all being very close by and within that kind of human scale is really important to push that convenience.
Anything, the panel, you want to add to walkability before we move on to cars? Okay, so next we wanted to talk about your thoughts on cars. I mean, it feels like cars are at a crossroads right now with all different types of cars and self-driving cars and flying cars, if those are coming yet. And I want to know, like, how will society change in the next 5 or 10 years and beyond? And how's the changing of cars gonna affect development? And how's that gonna affect what a suburb looks like in the next 5, 10 years and beyond, if we can think about that? And Jackie, let's start with you. Your thoughts on cars?
Yeah, okay. First, I would just say, in the near term, cars are still going to be huge. I mean, 5, 10 years, there's still going to be a huge role, but what do we do? I think circulation, there's a couple ways to look at it for development. One is structure and the other is circulation, and how do you handle both as it relates to cars? And what do you do with your masses and spaces? Circulation is a bit of an easier one, not easier, but you can tackle that with flexibility. If you're looking at it from a retail standpoint, what are the growing trends? While we try not to develop around trend, what can you do now that is helpful for that 5 and 10 year? Is it having more, is it separating uses? Is it putting uses together? Is it having more turnaround? Is it about distribution and the change of larger services, shared cars and drop-offs? What does that all look like on a given site as you plan for it? How you use your structures, now that's a different topic, and I think we're going to talk about that to some degree in a bit later. I did, interestingly, and this kind of tags on to something that was just mentioned a moment ago from David. I read an article this morning from Kathy Engelbert. She's the CEO at Deloitte, and she was talking about driverless cars and trucks in more from an economic standpoint. What does that mean for unemployment? I thought it was really interesting, but some of the notes within it that I thought were compelling were that regardless of what is the uncertainty of it, it's likely going to prompt gains in efficiency and productivity, making each mile of travel less expensive meaningfully, and that can leave consumers or customers with more surplus income to spend for other goods, services, and infrastructure. So what happens then? What do you do when you're not spending that same dollar and it's shared? It's a shared dollar on transportation. So forward-thinking stuff, we remain super hopeful. We think a lot about our circulation differently than we do our structures. How can we be most flexible with our existing portfolio as well as our new builds? And they're both very different.
So you think that your future thoughts on cars is affecting how you develop now and how you think about development?
I absolutely do. It depends on what you're developing. If it's a hospital or education or retail, I think from my perspective, the retail components are coming along faster than some of the other sectors of business because they are doing different things, mostly as it relates to distribution and touching the customer in different ways. And so they're asking for more. But how do you overlay those asks with the municipal asks to put it together on a plan is dynamic, but fun. I mean, I think that's exciting.
Tim, how are you planning for Ramsey with cars, and what cars might be or look like here shortly?
Right, I'd just echo the first comments that obviously cars aren't going away and we need to plan for that. And the perception we fight as planners sometimes is that if we're pro-transit or pro-bicycle, then in turn we're anti-automobile, and that couldn't be further from the fact. So in Ramsey, we focus a lot on options. So we've got Highway 10 along the Mississippi River, but we've got the North Star as an option, one option to alleviate congestion. We have the Mississippi River Trail as an option. All the while, we've invested a lot of time and energy into the Highway 10 Access Planning Study with significant capital investments that are required for that. So we haven't forgotten about the need to plan for the automobile. And then as we just talk about just our basic infrastructure design, we talked a little bit about how that's evolved. Before, it was all about walkability first, and as we've evolved as a culture, sometimes we get away from that. And I'm going to steal a comment from Lucy with St. Paul in a previous panel we had that talked a little bit about sometimes we see the sidewalks as an amenity or the walkability as an amenity. And we got to get back to sidewalks aren't an amenity. They're a basic infrastructure need and should be built into part of that. In Ramsey, we know that the driverless cars are a topic we need to address, and as we try to finalize our comprehensive plan, we know we're not going to solve for how we plan for that in the next year. It's too much in its infancy to know what's there, but it's going to be a goal that we need to monitor, and as there's some more data, we can start to think about what that means. But in the short term, we know that just technology in vehicles has impacted our public infrastructure needs. For example, electric cars are becoming a little bit more popular, and when it comes to public parking facilities, we're thinking about putting those electric vehicle charging stations. With Metro, say Hy-Vee, if you go to Hy-Vee, you notice that they're building in electric vehicle stations into their private development too. So there's some short and long-term goals that we should at least be thinking about. We might not solve it today, but if we have it as a goal now, we all know that transportation planning takes decades to unfold, so we should start putting goals in our land use plans today.
David, how does the future of cars affect how you think about your developments now?
Well, specifically about driverless cars, it isn't really having a large impact on our short to medium term planning. We have a strategy within the company as long-term holders of property, and we're working on a variety of redevelopment sites right now. And the horizon for those investments are usually about 15 to 20 years. And so the autonomous car inflection point from a decision-making perspective is not upon us yet. But I think more specifically about parking, we have a lot of property that is TOD. We're actually on the front of the brochure that Lucy was waving around with respect to the development standards. And that project in particular has 0.3 stalls of parking per unit of housing, and that works because it's right next to a train station. And so the parking impacts of light rail do really roll all the way down to the types of projects that we choose to put in locations.
George, can you add to that? How's cars affecting your developments?
Whether it be a horse or a personal transportation device, we're not going to do away with the individual desire to be able to get around in the community on their own time schedule and on their own need. But we are certainly seeing more options. 10 years ago or 15 years ago, if we built a garage, we would have 22-foot Impalas parked in about 80% of them. And now when we build new garages, I would tell you we probably have about 10 to 15% of the garage space is now bicycles. And another 15 to maybe 40% are smaller cars. And we also have shared vehicles. The change is not overnight, it is yearly, decade-wise, and I do think your parking in cars will change in the next 15 to 25 years. I do agree, I think we'll have more options, not less. And so I think you'll start seeing that people want both light rail, they'll want that personal transportation vehicle, they'll want a shared vehicle, they'll want a new, self-driverless Uber. So our options in our ideas about what is transportation in our development is going to have to incorporate being more creative, having more options available for our users. I do think in the next 20 years, we'll probably start seeing that the U.S. automobile industry actually starts seeing some decline in production of the standard car. I don't think they're projecting any of that in the next 10 years, so we have to keep building those parking spaces as long as consumers keep buying them. But I do think we can start looking for more options in our development coming every day, and we're creative about that, and I think cities are creative about that. I would encourage cities not to say, no more parking, stop the parking, but to start looking at what happens to these parking spaces in 15 or 20 years. And we're doing that. We're looking at some suburban developments where we have parking lots that will become future building pad sites. We'll have, even in our urban developments, we're looking at building parking garages that can add housing on top of it once we develop, once the housing need is, or the parking need is reduced. But it does add to the complexity of the formulas, but I think we need to look both for the need today, which is real, and for what these parcels and parking structures can be used for in 15 to 25 years.
Kirsten, there my mic's on. Kirsten, would you ever say that to George? You can't have any parking in this retail development in Hopkins?
I think we would, yeah. We actually have a district parking model in Hopkins, so no one development has to provide parking. It's shared within a system. And you know, we're in Hopkins, we're kind of thinking driverless cars are on a much shorter horizon than people on the panel here. I think 5 years from now that everyone having their own car is going to be a really rare thing. So we're talking about it through our comp plan process. We're talking about, you know, what about all those single family garages? You know, what are we going to allow people to do with those? Because that's going to be pretty much obsolete except for storing stuff, which people still like to do in their garage. So I guess that's still a use. But
Yeah, and my mom,
we're looking
yeah.
at garages. We're looking at all this municipal parking that we have. We're looking at those lots as opportunities for infill development, and we're hoping by the time we get those projects teed up, the driverless cars will be more prominent, and we'll be able to look at, you know, much better use of land parking outside of that core area where today we spend way too much land planning for cars. We did a study recently looking at Hopkins. You know, over half the land is used for cars, and that really is imbalanced with how people, I think, want to live. They want more retail, more entertainment experiences. They want more life on the street, and we're getting that through taking away some of those automobile dominated spaces and using parking on our street for things like street cafes. And it's really been well received, and we continue to kind of chip away at where the car is kind of had some sacred ground, and looking at ways to take that back.
Yeah, I play for Main Street's softball team since 1979, actually. And so I've seen a lot of parking taken away in downtown where the patios now are coming out in these temporary platforms out into the street. And that's been received well in Hopkins.
Yeah, I mean, not across the board. There's certainly individual businesses that don't benefit, at least from their perspective, and they push back a little bit when their customer can't park right in front of their business anymore. But that's really the minority. Vast majority of people are loving the extra life on the street, the vibrancy. They're seeing people look like they're having a great time, and they kind of want to do that too. So it's helping businesses, I think, bring in a lot stronger customer base than they had previously.
Yeah, I agree with it. And then this morning I can think of 3 cars I wish were driverless based on how those drivers are driving this morning. I hope you know, self-driving cars let me in when I'm entering onto Highway 100. So Bob, we just got to wrap up with you on this topic, on how this is affecting your city and your thoughts on the future of the car.
Well, one comment. I keep thinking about right now in this country, the majority of people in poverty live in suburbs, and a lot of those are first ring suburbs. And if you think of this region, we have 26 first ring suburbs that comprise 650,000 people, and that's twice the size of Minneapolis and 3 times the size of St. Paul. And so you've got that issue, plus you've got the aging population and people who don't want to drive or aren't able to drive. So how are these people going to how are they going to move around? They're not, you know, they either can't afford a car or they're not able to drive. And my understanding of the existing Metro Transit model is, you know, you got to get so many riders per hour or mile, and that's very efficient. It's just not very equitable. So how do we serve those populations that either can't afford a car or who won't be able to drive? And we know where they're going to be. They're sitting in the first ring suburbs right now, and that's where this issue, the population is going to get older faster, and it's going to be, you're going to see a greater number of people in poverty. In Oakdale, for example, which everybody thinks is sunny and 72, maybe 70, it's not quite like Minnetonka, but 17% of our population is at or below 150% of the federal poverty level, and it's in 1/2 of the city. So I think this issue of the role of cars and how people get around, we have to think of it in terms of neighborhoods and not just sort of this this regional thing, but we need to get down to the micro level when we do our planning.
And Bob, I'm going to stick with you here because just last week an article came out in the Minneapolis-St. Paul Business Journal talking about the number of parking spaces in downtown Minneapolis and the number of spaces that are being lost every month. It almost sounded like it was like the rainforest losing, daily, and how many spaces were going away. And then it talked about, there's parking available in the suburbs, and it almost sounded like, hey, come to the suburbs and park for free. on it. Can you talk about that and what that means? Is that really an issue, or it's not, or?
I think, generally speaking, it's not an issue in Oakdale today. However, I think at any time you've got an area, maybe it's a 5-block area or whatever, you've got to balance the transit option. So if you're going to remove parking, there have to be other options that can fill that space. And so we need to think, as I just mentioned, in these little geographies about how we provide service. And we need to get down to that level. So I think as long as there's a balance, if you take away parking and people can access it through transit or walking or biking, that's probably okay. But there needs to be a balance among the modes, and that needs to be evaluated at a very neighborhood or even development level.
Tim, your thoughts on that? Parking downtown versus suburbs? And
Yeah, so I'll use our example of our transit-oriented development, how fortunate we have been to be an infill station in the North Star commuter rail, and having the luxury of having a greenfield development and not having to look at it from a redevelopment perspective. However, our geographic proximity, when we try to look at parking strategies of some of our peer communities, is a bit challenging. We have a couple options. If we try to push that solely on the private developer, we're right on the fringe of the metropolitan area, and if we push too hard, they're going to go to one of our peer communities and move on. We also know that if we want to push the parking district strategy, structure parking is more expensive than surface parking, that we need to be a partner in that solution too, and so we look at different financial tools to have that happen. So I know we're running a bit short on time as we go through that, so I'll kind of stop there.
You're fine. No, you're fine. You're fine. You can keep. Well, let's just keep going right down the line, Kirsten. This issue of, hey, there's no parking in downtown, come to the suburbs.
Parking's a really tough subject, and it costs money to do it right, which is hiding it, basically putting it underground or in a structure or behind the development. But it's the right thing to do. I mean, you're not going to have a walkable environment if you don't have uses very close together and parking not separating them to make it difficult to walk. I think if there's like a downside of what's happening now, I think it's that people are choosing where they live very strategically about what they want, especially for transit. And so we're starting to see people move into Hopkins that are planning on light rail being an option for them. They want to be a one-car, no-car family, and there's a lot of self-selection, I think, going on. I think that's only going to lead to bigger disparities between our cities, which I don't think is a positive thing. I think the more people are around people that don't think like them, I think that's where you have interesting communities, and unfortunately, I think we're getting to be kind of homogeneous. Car lovers are seeking out places where there's ample parking, and people that want a more urban, close to their neighbor environment are seeking out places in suburbs like Hopkins. I just see it as a trend, and I don't know that it's all positive.
David, working together, suburbs, cities, urban, in cars,
together.
parking.
Well, I think I'm going to bounce off of Kirsten here. The downside of not having enough parking in downtown Minneapolis is obviously from a landlord perspective, it's hard to lease space if you're pushing that cost into kind of an externality for the tenant. And that's kind of the world that I operate in. We don't have property in downtown, so it doesn't really bother me too much that there isn't a lot of extraneous parking in downtown Minneapolis. I actually see that as an opportunity for us with our developments in close-in neighborhoods like Bassett Creek Valley. One of the things that we are absolutely marketing as a part of our projects over in the Bassett Creek Valley, right in the Harrison neighborhood, is access to relatively inexpensive parking and the amenities of downtown. And so I think that's kind of a natural outgrowth of scarcity of resource in a location and the demand being fairly strong, and the demand now starts looking just a little bit outside of their comfort zone, and that pushes that growth a bit out. And I think that that's going to largely have a really positive impact on the neighborhoods that are immediately surrounding downtown. The amenities will improve over time, and the tax base will increase, and I think that's something that really helps those neighborhoods.
George, can you add on to that? Your thoughts on the advantage of having parking in suburbs?
Well, we're doing our part to get rid of every single parking lot in Minneapolis and St. Paul. I think we've taken 15 of them out of service in the last 10 years, and we'll keep plugging away until they're all gone. But the removal of parking does not treat everybody fairly, and I think people need to understand that. I do think it impacts, low and moderate income people much differently. They don't have all the options. Transportation is a huge component of their cost of living. And when you start looking at convenience of why they may not be able to afford the car, their job is probably in an area that's going to require a car. And if you start doing away with parking, start asking them to pay $400 a month in parking spaces, you may find that you are disproportionately influencing, having impacts on the people that you did not plan to have an impact on. It clearly is not fair on all areas of retail. You go talk to a retailer who's trying to make it in a neighborhood, and you do away with this parking, and the customer has the choice of Amazon.com delivering their food and groceries, but they can't park at the grocery store because there's no parking at the grocery store. People make choices. It's going to be a lot more convenient for you to go on your, personal phone and order delivery than it is going to be for that retailer down the street for you to stop at their store and buy something that could maybe keep their lights on. Restaurants and service are different because restaurants and service, you tend to want some walkable, but I think you're going to have a dramatic impact on your local retailer by the decision to do away with parking. The very small retailer that cities want are going to be pressed out of service between the options that people have to buy elsewhere and not be able to park when they want to buy something at the retailer. So I think there will be unintended consequences by the desire to push away parking as a convenient way for people in neighborhoods. And I think your retailer, which is already facing a lot of pressure, is going to be one of the very first things that will disappear from your communities as you continue to have this desire to reduce parking.
Those are challenging thoughts, George. Any questions at this? Comments? We're all good back here. We're intently listening to what you have to say. And Jackie, I want to hear what you have to say on this topic.
Two thoughts on that topic. One is, to some degree, speaks to the audience. This audience is tremendously eclectic. For those of you that I know, your architects, your developers, your city folks, your municipal folks, your parking experts. And I think what is super interesting right now is that everyone is more knowledgeable, in my opinion, than ever before on parking and parking ratios and what does it mean. I think that's fascinating. For me, back in the day, working with a large-scale format retailer, it was incredibly dynamic to go to a municipality that had a set parking number where I was the one asking for a reduced parking count because I didn't need a 5 per thousand. I only needed a 3. It's just great. I mean, to hear David throw out numbers of what's working in residential near a transit stop, there's going to be more and more and more of that. And the familiarity of what's working and not working is something that we all have to be a part of the game of. And certainly as it lowers ratios, what's appropriate and how do you share the parking and how do you do mixed use and how do you share? I mean, those are really, those are toughies, but I think more people are educated today than ever have been before, and that's super encouraging. I think one topic that we haven't talked about, and then we'll move on, is businesses and corporate in suburbia, and what does that look like for parking, and getting back to walkability. Some do it fantastically, where they integrate their corporate campuses and offices in suburbia, and be it what it is for the car, what they do for the walkability and the connectivity of regional and local is fantastic for the trails. And they're getting after it from a health standpoint. They're getting after it from a this is what people want standpoint. It's more personal. And so maybe that's less about car. It is about car to some degree because those businesses, instead of maybe locating downtown, they're locating in the suburbs because, they can, and that's where people can park. But how they're enhancing walkability, I think, is a city thing and a personal thing and a corporate thing. And I think some of the examples I've seen are fantastic, and I hope it continues to get better.
So maybe being flexible and thinking about each development, so maybe being flexible and thinking about each individual development is the way of the future and way we should go, rather than saying like all retail, five spaces per 1,000, all offices, this is what offices are, and so on. I mean, I'm encouraged to hear that, and I'd like to see that continue. I just thought of something on walkability too. Our office at Westwood has weekly group walks, like at 2 o'clock. So an email goes out, and a crowd gathers, and off they go walking. So it becomes important then for offices, like, well, where do I walk? Where do I walk on? So those are all really interesting and challenging thoughts. So we've touched on walkability. We've talked about cars, transit. I want to talk about now transit and how transit is affecting and how it's going to affect the suburbs in our development. And I think, George, I'm going to start with you on using transit and integrating transit into the suburbs and how that works for development.
We have seen the dramatic impact on good mass transit in downtown Minneapolis and St. Paul. And it's really, what has happened in downtown Lowertown with the light rail, what's happened in downtown Minneapolis and along Hiawatha corridor have been dramatic increases in occupancy and fairly dramatic increases in rent sustainability. We're active in Denver, and we know that we can, if you're along light rail in Denver, you can probably get 20 to 25% higher rent in an apartment building along a light rail station in Denver. It's a more comprehensive system. We are active in the suburbs right now. They're not in mass transit housing developments. Our first one was the heart of the city in Burnsville, where we built housing around a bus transit station. Mm-hmm. Buses don't have the sex appeal that light rail does. I would say it was effective, but didn't really move the number much. In both Coon Rapids right now and in Fridley, we're doing large housing development projects at the North Star line. And we're optimistic that the North Star will pick up some traffic. Right now, the mass transit lots along the North Star line are about 10% occupied during the day. We're more optimistic along that corridor in the long term, and so we're investing heavily along at 2 stations, both the Fridley one and Coon Rapids, in 300 to 400 units of housing and mixed use, thinking that the future will, if you put it in the field, it will come, some baseball term.
We got it.
But we are optimistic. I think the Southwest corridor has an incredible opportunity because you do have jobs along the Southwest corridor. Both United Health and some of the major employers along there. So I think you'll see the Southwest corridor have major development already and coming along. The bus is not quite the same engine as the light rail, and I just tell people to take both experiences. I think you could. I think we have to invest in a different type of bus. You go to Europe and London and you experience a bus ride in London or Paris. It's a different bus feel than we have in the Minneapolis.
In what way? How's it different?
I think it's a better investment in capital stock. It's more individualized, seat arrangements. Maybe we offer better accessibility for everybody, but we don't offer as much, individuality and comfort that you would have in a European bus experience. The buses in Europe, I think, are much more used and feel a little bit more comfortable to the user. We tend to have much wider buses. If you're behind one in the U.S., it seems like it's about 30% wider than the European bus.
Okay.
I think we need to look at some alternatives on our bus transportation systems. But the reader, when we poll people, and we do at our housing projects, most of them have a very positive experience on the light rail, and most of them do not have the same positive experience on the bus. So I would encourage the marketing people who are, trying to market to. We certainly get higher income and disposable incomes on people on light rail than we do on the bus transportation lines.
Interesting take. I haven't heard that before. David, your thoughts on the importance of transit in suburban development?
I think transit's really important for suburban development. We don't have any specifically suburban development on transit lines right now. We do have, as I mentioned, a variety of projects in the Basset Creek Valley, which is predominantly in the Harrison and Bryn Mawr neighborhoods, just northwest of here. And those developments are within the watershed of the first stop on the Southwest LRT line. And we think that's going to have a fairly large impact, God willing that gets built, on those developments and the types of tenancy and users that we can attract to those projects. I think that the broader scheme for us is really ensuring that the connectivity for that district that we're trying to build includes, quite a bit of pedestrian walkability as well as the bike access. I think that biking is a really big piece of it, especially for younger generation that are looking to not have cars, as a lot of folks have mentioned. But also, I think that's a way that we're seeing prospective tenants using to attract and retain their kind of key younger talent, is to have that bike infrastructure in place in their tenant suites or in the buildings. I'm sure everybody's fairly aware of that. That's not a small thing and is asked on pretty much every tour that I take for those properties down there. And so that connectivity of the bike trails and the prospective development of light rail within a quarter mile of a lot of the stuff we're working on is a big deal.
Jackie, let's stay with team private development. Over here, hi. Right here. Your thoughts on transit and your suburban development?
A couple things. One thought that George had mentioned about European travel that I was thinking Lucy would be the best expert to know the answer to, but nonetheless, to me it seems like with the bus, I don't disagree at all. The European travel, here it feels like the mass transit as it relates to a bus is more destination oriented. You go from work and you go home and back, those are the two things. It's less about the ethos of your day and your experience and how you go get stuff and how you go have coffee, which is more the European way. It's more about intermittent stops and, just the experience because you don't have a car. You don't need a car, right? So and perhaps that's just going to be the forthcoming trend as density increases and cars are used less here in the United States. But to me, that is one of the significant differences. If you've traveled and used mass transit, is you do a lot along the line, more I feel like than you do here. But then additionally, in terms of development, the serendipity is where what you want to do is in alignment with what the state wants to do and what the city wants to do and what the region wants to do. That's when things get really, really exciting. I feel like we're seeing more of that as transit is coming along, and that's really exciting. There's a lot of conflicting details to go through, and users, even if it's even looking at an area that has a future station, but there's buses that are coming for the park and ride. That's still really complicated, for circulation, and how do you make that happen in a mixed-use development? It's complicated. But it's exciting to know you're part of the game of something that everyone believes in. Mm-hmm. And those are areas that we look at. And I think, that things can be flexible and are expected to be flexible, and that we work together on them with Met Council and, Metro Transit and developers and the folks that want to be there is where the magic is.
Tim, interesting thoughts from the private side sector. How does that relate to Ramsey and Transit for Ramsey and development?
Yeah, so having the North Star and an active rail station has added value to our community. It's not the only aspect that has made us successful, and in isolation, it was not a factor that was going to do it on its own, but as a value add and as a contributing factor to the success of our community, absolutely it added to that success. We've seen several hundred units of housing come from the private sector that have at least cited in part that as a reason that they have come here. One of those being 230 units that was not going to come. It was high amenity market rate apartment building, 230 units that wasn't going to start building until that rail station was secured. So we know that it has attracted certain private development, both affordable housing and market rate housing. When we talk about transit, it's also important to talk about, at the core function, what that does. And although there is still some significant congestion on Highway 10, it has taken several hundred vehicles off the highway system each day. So that is another value add to our community. And then finally, I would add an aspect that we didn't necessarily anticipate, and it's not large in numbers, but the rail station's within a half-mile of a couple industrial parks. And we do have certain individuals that are either taking the one reverse commute or coming from Big Lake and Elk River to our industrial park to work. So it's an economic development tool in a way that we hadn't propped up as one of the key aspects of that as well. So it's encouraging to see that there's private development occurring in the Fridley Station and Coon Rapids Station. Shameless plug, just remember we have other stations with availability, Ramsey, Elk River, Big Lake. I don't want to forget about those communities too, because as you get further away from that central city, I think some of those stations that are further out oftentimes forget. So I'll plug to my other colleagues in Elk River and Big Lake that are doing some amazing things around their rail station as well. So we're very excited on a number of fronts and to see how North Star has had a success and it's an option. It hasn't solved our Highway 10 issues. It hasn't, done everything for us, but it certainly sets us, a notch above the rest, which is important for a community that is 30 miles out from the central business district, trying to do some really great things for our community, for our region.
Bob, you don't have the North Star Rail in your city somehow.
We've got 694.
You have 694. So transit and planning for transit, and how's transit being used now and in the future for Oakdale?
Well, Oakdale's about 44 years old, so we're kind of middle-aged, and we're making that transition into a lot of what people have been talking about here today. So we've got 2 express routes that work really well. People like it. A lot of our people work in Woodbury or White Bear, and up, but we don't have any suburb to suburb. The second thing that I'll just add is, as we move forward in development and redevelopment, we're focusing on the gray fields, the big boxers that have gone dark. We just did one of those. We're focusing on the strip corridors that are really struggling. And then we also have 2 stations, one and a half, I guess, on the BRT line that we're doing station area planning now. So we're going to focus our transit in those areas where the best opportunities are. The 2 other comments I'll make are this. As we're talking about how to make things more walkable and transit friendly, it's largely a technical solution, and I think everybody in this room knows how to put that puzzle together. What we don't often talk about is you have to convince 5 or 7 people on the city council to change policy. And they've been in that suburb for 30 years, and they're thinking, why can't I have my half-acre lot on a cul-de-sac? Everybody wants that. So I think that's where a lot of this effort has to be, and you have to talk to them about demographics, how things are changing and preparing for the future, not about clocked headways and articulated buses. Their eyes turn white and they glaze over. So there's a lot of education that has to be done for city councils to prepare the ground for making these policy changes. And then the last challenge I'll throw out to Metro Transit is, I don't know, anybody in here work for the fire service, fireman, firewoman, anybody? Well, if I asked you, if you're poor and you live in the suburbs and you have a really bad flu, how do you get to the clinic? You call the fire department. We have that all the time. People are calling the fire department because they have no transportation, they can't afford it, they're sick, they may not be having a heart attack, but the fire service can't say no. We have that a lot in Oakdale, so if Metro Transit has a solution to that, and I know other cities experience that, that would be really a cool thing if you could figure that out.
I hadn't heard that either. There's a couple of things
most people on the planning side don't ever talk to the fire or police department, but it's they have transportation issues.
Yes, and I've heard that in designing of neighborhoods and how to get school buses through and how to get emergency vehicles through into those situations. But then transit, how do we solve that issue on it? Kirsten, do you want to add on for Hopkins and the importance of transit? And you've got a light rail station coming, or more than. Oh yeah. There is right here. Okay.
I was just going to comment on having worked in the rural is in a different state, that's also a major problem getting people home from those services, even if you have transit, because transit so often shuts down at 6 or 7 p.m., and they may not get out of the emergency room until 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, if I could just add, and that is the difference between efficiency and equity. So we emphasize efficiency, but it's not equitable. So how do the people get home? So maybe they don't go to the clinic when they need to.
We're currently running 5 round-trip vans a day from Riverside Plaza to Amazon.com out in Shakopee. The bus lines do not work out there. We have a number of low and moderate income people living there trying to work every day, and the jobs are in Shakopee right now, and when the shift ends at midnight, there's no bus. And the idea that, I would reiterate that we need to be thinking about how does transportation work for people who are working different hours, different shifts, and what do we do to make it a more equitable system. We need to look at it as part of an overall solution here, and we are, missing it for a number of people.
Kirsten, can you add on to that and talk about Hopkins for us?
I'll just say transit's obviously important. If we want people to ditch their cars, you can only walk or bike so far. At least I can only walk or bike so far. Might be more fit than I, but it's just an important critical link. And we've, in Hopkins, have always benefited from a pretty good transit system. We've had great bus service, which has really shaped our community. When we talk to people looking for sites, service providers, charter schools, churches, lots of users are looking for places that are easy to get to, and so we've really benefited from bringing a lot of convenience to the community by having that transit available, thus making it a really great site for a lot of reasons. So it's shaped us in the past, maybe geared a little bit more towards affordable housing and service providers for lower income households. We now are bringing in a transit service that's going to cater to a wider range, I think, of people, really attracting young professionals and millennials and empty nesters and kind of the whole gamut. So we are pretty bullish on transit having a pretty big impact on the community. People want it in Hopkins. We're building for it today. Hopefully Southwest can catch up with us because we're constructing TOD developments now that are really geared around taking transit and biking as your primary modes of transportation.
We got another question here, a comment.
I just wanted to comment on the issue with Amazon and Shakopee. I work for Minnesota Valley Transit Authority, and I did the service planning for Scott County. And one of the things that we've actually done is we've partnered with employers in that area, including Amazon. And recently on Saturday, we did start some new service from the Cedar Riverside area direct to Amazon that coordinates with their shift times. So sometimes these sort of solutions, such as partnering with large employers in an area, is important to making transit service successful in low density areas. And it's not just necessarily about the residential density, but also the job and employment density is also crucial to making a successful transit service as well.
Thank you. Anything to respond? Bob, go ahead.
This notion of Amazon locating in Shakopee, they should have gone to the TCAP site. It would have been a lot easier to move people from Ramsey County up there. So when cities make land use decisions like that and then expect the bus to come out, maybe there's something else they have to pay for that. When you make those decisions on land use, if you make good decisions and you locate land uses where there's already a transit system and a population that wants to work there, maybe you get more credit. But just to put it out in the periphery and then expect everybody to run the bus out there, the two have to work together. David, do you have any thoughts on that, with what's been discussed in the last 5 minutes?
I tend to agree with Bob. On the brokerage team that I work for or worked with in Seattle, we sold the Amazon campus to Amazon, and I watched that market that user go from 300,000 square feet to 14 million square feet in a 45 million square foot office market. And so the change that Amazon is having on King County and on Seattle is incredible, and it's really scary for a lot of people. I don't think that that change is going to come to the Twin Cities very quickly. I kind of, to jump on to Bob's comments, I think trying to guide Amazon in any direction is exceedingly challenging. They have a lot of leverage from a user standpoint. It's partially because of those jobs. And so that's a very tricky balancing act that pits different municipalities against each other effectively, and they're really good at doing that.
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
So I think that David brings up a good point, because that's the difference between economic growth and the quality of economic development. So oftentimes we emphasize growth, more jobs, more buildings, but there's a public cost and a private cost to that. So we have to focus on the quality of growth, or at least put the cost of economic growth where it belongs, back on Amazon or the city of Shakopee for making those kinds of decisions.
Okay, yeah. Well, then I'm going to throw one more question since we're on that. I want to talk about millennials, if we could, and their effect. And David, I'm going to start with you on your thoughts on how that is changing development, if at all or not. Or
I think it is. That's also probably a naive and narcissistic response.
appropriately enough.
For the last, 11 years, I've lived in locations that are very transit oriented. And so from a personal standpoint, I made the choice to try to make it work in the city and have a home close to transit. That was an important value decision for me, and obviously I have the means to be able to make that happen. That's not everybody's ability. From a professional standpoint, we get, we work in urban neighborhoods, and we get a variety and a broad range of feedback, input, and criticism from neighborhood groups and stakeholders on our projects. There is a very keen, line of thinking on a couple of our projects that they need to be pushing harder with more density and with more access for the bikes and the pedestrian orientation. It's very challenging to do in some of the locations that we have, given the constraints. And I think it's we've talked about it a lot here. It's a balancing act, because consumers that have checkbooks are kind of across the whole demographic spectrum, and so trying to get that kind of big group of millennials to push the development in a certain direction that they really want to see, that will have a big impact for 20 or 30 years in their built environment, is really important. And I think that our elected officials are starting to pay a lot of attention to that demographic, because they vote and they care and they're really engaged a lot of the time, and it's important.
Jackie and George, can you guys talk about baby boomers and millennials together, and the tug of war going on, or not a tug of war, and how that affects your thinking at all in your developments? Jackie, you want to start?
Yeah, a couple thoughts have been running through my head as we've been talking, and I think one high level, and we'll get more into the age thing in a minute, but is developing what is needed, not what is wanted. And I think as we develop, it's really dynamic to hear what municipalities want versus what a market study is showing is needed. Right. And that's a crux for us a lot of what development looks like. But as it relates to the millennials and development, I just feel like there's more connectivity that's wanted, and connectivity means so many things, as we started with, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's social, it's physical, it's so many different attributes of connectivity, and they're just looking for more of that. And what is that? And I don't know how many people have been to the Google campus, and what, or maybe Target North campus is another really great example of what does your day look like in connectivity to your infrastructure, to your walkability, to your mass transit, to the developing area around you. I would like to think there'll be more and more and more of that. I think if you take, and maybe this isn't exactly a millennial piece, but I think it is in terms of the average age of the worker, but Target North Campus and the Botano line, and it took a fair bit of bravery, frankly, for that corporate campus to go out there, and a lot of incentive in Brooklyn Park. But it's the walkability there is tremendous, and it was ahead of the retail, and it was ahead of the infrastructure. And there's risk there's huge risk for not only developers but for corporate folks.
I'm gonna jump in.
Amazon is different, but
I know we're running a little short on time, so George, I'm going to jump in quick. Sorry, Jackie, and just get your thoughts on the millennial and baby boomer effect going on right now.
Well, clearly, those two segments, just because of headcount, are dominating the housing market right now. The baby boomers having been the largest population coming through, now downsizing their single-family home and looking for convenience, and the millennials who have delayed the home buying purchase and have stayed in the smaller multifamily housing units longer than the previous generation, have been a major factor on the housing market in the last 10 years and driven it across the country. It's focused on higher amenities, more connectivity, more urban development, and I think that that change in demographics is probably responsible for about 60% of all the urban development going on in the U.S. I do think there'll be some decision the millennials have to make about having kids in school districts eventually, and I think that could backfill some of the suburban housing. The millennials are dumping their big homes in the suburbs, and those are going. The big homes are clearly going unsold, and I think you're going to start seeing some major changes in the big home market. It's not something the millennials want. And so if you're sitting on 2 acres and $800,000 house on a golf course, I wouldn't invest more in those futures.
So almost going to get yes and no's from the public sector here on, are these thoughts about millennials and baby boomers affecting your long-range planning at all, or it's not an effect? Kirsten, you want to start?
You're not going to get a yes or no answer because it's the last question. I got all these points I wanted to make, so.
Well, here, I'll sit down.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So, I think it's great. Millennials and baby boomers are wanting a lot of the same product, and we're seeing that hugely in Hopkins. I can put to the date, January 2015, everything changed, and we started to see office users that weren't, their employees weren't willing to walk or weren't willing to not be able to walk to lunch and different kinds of things during their day, and they wanted a different location. We're seeing empty nesters and millennials coming to Hopkins for the school district, for those that are kind of coming out of their younger living and want something for a family. We're having a huge influx of those people. The businesses have completely brought in a new vibe on Main Street. We now have a comedy store and a cupcake store, and so our retail is really doing well too, and it's all around our downtown because it is walkable, and it's got all these great amenities, and we're seeing it appeal across the board, and that's really exciting. I would say, to Bob's point on how to get the political support, my recommendation for that is to really know your system, know your streets, know where your connections need to be made, focus on your priorities, and design them really to the state of the art. We had an opportunity to do a new street, and we weren't thinking about a cycle track, and we luckily had a consultant come in and say, why aren't you building a cycle track? Why are you planning for, kind of what was in the past? Think about the future. And so we're building cycle tracks, we're doing public
Didn't you
art.
actually put in a temporary one just so everyone could look at it
We did,
first?
and I think that's my point, is to get that political support, which we didn't have just right out of the gate. We did a temporary installation, laid it out with AstroTurf and cones, and had people come test it out, and people were so excited about it. Told the mayor what a great idea he had here, and then he was completely on board and was hugging staff. Yeah. He's not the mayor anymore. I can talk a little freer about his perspective.
Okay, Tim, you're up.
So yeah, obviously the two demographics we've focused on are driving a lot of change, and it is impacting our long-range planning and also the projects, private and public, that are coming in. And I'd be remiss being a planner not to stress the importance of having a plan. We started planning for some of this 10 years ago, and that plan is already out of date. So if there's an illustration of the need to update your comp plans at least every 10 years, we're seeing it right now and how dynamic the market can be. So we're excited about that, and we're seeing it come to fruition, and we're excited to see where our next comp plan goes. But when you look back historically, we're seeing that change in the market over the last several decades. So Ramsey's first wave of development was in the 1970s, and it was 1 acre lot, 2 acre lots on private well and septic, and there were several thousand housing units that had that. Then we moved in the 80s and the 90s, and it was your traditional suburban quarter-acre lots on well and municipal sewer and sanitary sewer and water. And now we're seeing even more change, not only in multifamily, which we're talking about here, but for us in Ramsey, even the single family, the detached product market is changing a lot. And we just approved a 300-lot subdivision that is a much smaller lot than what we had traditionally seen over the last several decades. And I just want to focus on, a lot of times we focus on the differences between the millennials and baby boomers, but those two demographics are much closer in what they're looking for in their housing choices than we might think.
That's an interesting thought, too. I agree with you. Bob, final thoughts?
I'll just say this, that I think the developers and cities have been driving the market since the beginning. I think this notion of development is just responding to market demand. That's not been my observation, because if you look at the suburban form, it's hard for me to believe that everybody in the United States since 1950 has chosen the same urban form. So I think developers and cities can drive land use planning and development in ways that promote walkability and transit, and do it smartly, because there's always good reasons to do it. Somebody's going to use it. But I think I want to emphasize that I don't think we're just responding to what millennials want. We have to go out and lead the way to make things more, walkable, transit friendly, and I think cities need to do more to do small area planning and take the lead on that, instead of here comes the same suburban residential subdivision we've been approving for 40 years. So I think we need to be more of a leader in that.
Thank you. Any comments, questions? Here you go.
Yes. So I'm interested in the question of equity and how that moves forward in transit-oriented development, because a lot of points have been made about higher rents, higher land values around specifically light rail, but transit-oriented development in general. So I was just wondering what the panel's thoughts on that was.
Equity, you mean, can you be more specific?
Equity in terms of, maybe someone can ditch their car, but they're paying higher rents. So equity in terms of income, how that's going to be accommodated for in these transit-oriented developments.
Anyone want to raise their hand and take that? Kirsten, I saw you first. Buzz in.
I would just say from the Southwest LRT Greenland Extension perspective, we spent a lot of time analyzing our current housing stock, kind of trying to project what it might look like after light rail is operational, and the gentrification issue is a big concern to us. All of the cities have been really looking at what policies are right for them and how they can have more affordable housing developed, as we look at some pretty significant increases in the number of units available. So I don't think we found that magic pill, especially where it comes to preservation of existing affordable housing, but we're looking at it, it's on everyone's radar, and we're hoping that we can do better than maybe some of the other regions where affordability is just gone for a lot of cities.
David, I saw your hand up for a second.
Yeah, it's no secret that there's a huge demand for affordable housing across the metro and further out, and there is not enough supply for that. We are working towards additional affordable housing in our portfolio. That is something that we want to invest heavily in. The two projects that we've opened recently that are both affordable right next to the Hiawatha line leased up almost instantaneously. I think there's probably 10 times the demand than we have supply in the inner city or in the urban core. I think that issue about equity and then the gentrification kind of on top of it is a really tricky one. We have kind of an internal philosophy that incremental change is actually a lot better than trying to blow up and start over. And because oftentimes the blow up and start over approach, though it's a huge infusion of capital, can really change the landscape fairly dramatically and force a bunch of renters out of the market. Harrison neighborhood in particular, this is obviously top of mind for me, is I think upwards of 70% renters in a lot of single family homes in that neighborhood. And so the work that we're trying to do there, we're very purposeful and dedicated to ensure that we have long-term affordability as a large component for any projects that we work on there. We've got 104 units of affordable housing going in to the prime block of our lead development there, and that's going to be affordable in perpetuity, at least through my lifetime. And I think that that's the type of commitment that neighborhoods should really try to push for if they don't want to see huge gentrification occur and force a bunch of folks out that won't be able to have equity rise with the tide of the rest of the area. So it's a hard issue.
Is that okay? Lucy, how are we doing on time? Oh, George wants to say something? Okay, George. We got to hear you though first, George. There you go.
After about 35 years, you get asked to sit on a number of different boards and advisory groups, and I am on the Minnesota Housing Partnership. And one of the statistics out there is that we are producing no new net affordable housing in the 7-county area. In fact, we are going backwards every year. For every wonderful project like you hear about Dave or our projects, we lose about 1.5 units, and that's in the face of a growing population in need of affordable housing. So the number of affordable housing units is decreasing every year, even with everybody's wonderful efforts, and the amount of need for affordable housing is going up about 20 to 30% a year, with a growing diversity between demand, or growing gap between demand and supply. Surprisingly, as you've heard, if it's a really successful mass transit development, it drives up rents. So success does not necessarily overall bring in more affordable housing. It may in fact create more market rate housing. I mean, it is unlikely we're going to find any huge new resource to produce more affordable housing in Minnesota or in the country. The dollar amounts targeted for it on the national level are not increasing. The amounts being targeted at the state level are pretty static. We've had a couple good years and a couple years of no growth. And so when people look back, even with a lot of effort from Hopkins and other cities, the net impact in our 7-county area is going to be less affordable housing and more expensive housing. That's not what we want to say. That's not what we want to do. And I think we'll take a bigger effort to make that needle change. I do think it's maybe a little bit easy to put this forward, but the best alternative to not have, unless there's a major change in resources for housing, our best hope is that we can provide more jobs. If you can't change the housing needle, maybe you can change the income needle. That too is a big effort. I made some comments about Amazon. It is producing jobs for affordable housing people in downtown Minneapolis. And so one way to help a bit on the gap is to improve people's incomes. And that, I think, mass transit does. I think mass transit does provide the ability for people to get to jobs where they can get a better income. I think that is maybe the most positive thing I think I can say about mass transit is the ability to improve low-income people's options about being able to get jobs. Producing more housing units is something that glasses people's eyes over when you start hearing the dollar amounts that are needed. It makes MnDOT's budget and the light rail budget seem minor compared to the amount of dollars that would have to be put into the housing market to make affordable housing.
Thank you, George. We're going to end it there. That's a good spot to end. Before we clap, hang on, Lucy. I want to thank a couple people, and the first person I want to thank is you. Thank you for arranging this and the entire Metro Transit staff, including Michael Greff, who's back here somewhere, right here. Thank you for helping to organize it. And one more person I want to point out is Tom Goodrum here with Laux, who did a lot of work in putting this panel together as well. I feel very fortunate to be part of this discussion today, so thank you for having me. And I think this was really a great panel, great forum. I think you should do it more often. I want to thank HGA. Yes, I want to thank HGA for this wonderful space, right? This space is incredible with the light rail going by and the twins, and this is just beautiful. It's like a TV studio, I felt. And no, we got more to thank. Yeah, you can say, this is Wendy. Hi, Wendy Wolf.
This is Met Council Member
I'm Councilmember Wendy Wolf from the Met Council, and I just want to say a few words to defend Shakopee. I'm sorry, but
Okay. Well, look at the time. Sorry. Cameras are off. Go ahead.
no, I just want people to know that the city of Shakopee has been in the transit taxing district for more than 40 years, and they've been working on transit service and adapting to changing circumstances for a very long time. They were an opt-out community on their own, and then they joined MBTA a few years ago, and they've been working very hard with the Shakopee Midwakaton Sioux as well, who have their own very large transit system. You've seen the purple Mystic Lake buses probably all over the metro that bring both gamblers and workers to the casinos. And they're trying to find cooperative ways to all work together to adapt to changing transportation needs. And so if we only focus on the Metro Transit service area or only focus on the LRT lines, I think we're doing a disservice to other parts of the region that really are trying to adapt to changing transportation needs.
Thank you. And I think what goes for Shakopee goes for every single city and suburb around the whole area. And okay, now we're good. Okay, now we can thank our panel. Give them a nice round of applause. Thank you, everybody.